We will give it a few minutes to make sure that everybody who wants to join has had time to join. While we're waiting, I'd just like to say thank you to everyone for coming and joining us today. On the slide here, you can see we've got an enormous number of registrants for this webinar. It's really lovely to see. And a really big diversity of companies as well who've joined us today. So some very familiar names to us. EDF are there. We've got Screwfix, LiveGulp. Everyone from Anne Summers to the National Archives has joined us. There are more on the list. I'm very pleased as a clinical practitioner to see we have some speech and language therapists with us today, so welcome. And I know we've got a huge diversity of different roles as well joining us on the call. So we've got retail, utilities, finance, public sector, travel, leisure. I can't think of anyone who's not represented in this list. So a huge welcome to all of you. Please do feel free to introduce yourselves on the chats that we have available and talk amongst yourselves while we go through the day. Before we get started, just a quick introduction. I know some of you know us very well, but for those of you who aren't familiar with Bunnyfoot, we are an independent agency, and we've been working in this field for around 25 years now. And during that time, we really have become known and been given a really well-deserved reputation for just excellence in research and design, and a commitment to founding all that we do on evidence-based practice. We stand at about 40 strong at the moment, and within our team we have a broad range of specialisms, from strategists to researchers and some visual designers. So we really do offer a full range service. We're based in the UK, but we do operate globally. So we have offices and labs in London and Sheffield, and we can work through our partners with users across the world, and we often do. We're not entirely alone though. About 5 years ago, we joined the Sideshow Group. So we're very lucky to have a bunch of sister agencies working alongside us. And as you can see from the slide, that means that through Bunnyfoot and by working and engaging with us, we can give you access to an even wider range of services to meet your needs. So do come and find out more about us if you're not familiar with us already. Have a look at the website. But today we're here to talk about the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and very specifically to take you through what we've learned about the most recent update. So the most recent update to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, making it number 2.2, was released in October, and John and I are going to take you through that today. We're also going to try and make sure we save some time at the end. So if you have any questions, we would love for you to share them with us. And we'll do our best to make sure we can get to at least some of those questions at the end of today's session. We're going to be here for an hour. I mentioned questions, so I can see lots of you introducing yourselves on the chat. If you can't hear immediately, usually what happens is it takes a little while just for the audio to connect. We have about a 5-second delay between us speaking and people coming online. So lovely to see all the conversations going on in the chat. We might try and keep up to date with that as presenters as we can. Obviously, you can understand that's a bit tricky. But if you have a question for us, please use the tab Q&A. So if you look at the top, you'll see there's a grayed out tab Q&A. And if you place your questions in there, it means that we'll know where they are and they won't get lost in the chat. You'll also be able to upvote each other's questions as well. So if there's a question that's already been asked and you are also interested in that one, just press the upvote option and we'll know which are the most important questions for you. I'm sure a lot of you are interested in knowing whether or not you can have the recordings of this session. So it won't be available immediately after the session, but Joe will be in contact with everyone who's attended and be able to share those recordings with you. But I guess I should introduce ourselves as well. So we'll start with me. My name is Louise. For those of you who don't know me, I am a digital consultant for around 25 years myself. The number keeps growing. It feels, I referred to as a vintage UX the other day, which I thought was both flattering and somewhat annoying. I've worked in digital content and accessibility for a long time. And as you can see there, I've worked with brands around the world and at a high level making sure that they understand, both evaluating and designing for them so that they can get their most, provide the best for a diverse group of users. But I'm also a practicing neurological physiotherapist as well. So that means that I have really, really good fortune to be able to spend time with and work alongside some people with some very complex disabilities. So I'm more than happy to bring some of that insight into the room as well. So that's me. I've been with Bunnyfoot for about 2 years now, and alongside John, I deliver some of the training, and we deliver a full range of services, but also specialise in accessibility evaluations, testing, and recommendations and design. But I'll hand over to John, who's our co-host today.
Thanks, Louise. Hi, everybody. My name's John Goodall. I'm a UX consultant and head of accessibility at Bunnyfoot. I've been at Bunnyfoot since 2014, which feels like a lifetime, but also feels like yesterday. Like Louise, I work with clients and I also do training as well. So my client work, I do all sorts of stuff: interaction design, usability testing, accessibility audits, testing and evaluation, interviews, information architecture work. As a trainer, I teach the Certified Professional for Usability and User Experience Foundation course, as well as our own in-house developed practical accessibility course. I'm also the vice chairman of the UXQB, who are the organisation responsible for developing the CPUX curricula, and I facilitate their accessibility working group. And I've been working in the field of human-centered design in one way or another, like Louise, for over 25 years, so also vintage. But previously, I've worked as head of commerce, an education specialist, so I've got lots of practical experience at applying the kinds of techniques and methodologies that we're going to be touching on today. Back to you, Louise.
Actually, I'm going to leave it in your capable hands, John. So we will be going through the updates as we go through, but we've included a section at the start here. We know that there's a huge range of experience and awareness of accessibility issues and technical issues on the call. So I'm going to hand back to John. You've heard about all of his credentials and his extraordinary experience in this area, and he's going to overview what the main themes that we're talking about today.
Thanks, Louise. Yeah, obviously the webinar's running smoothly because I completely forgot I wasn't supposed to hand back to you at all. I was just supposed to carry on, so I'll do that now. So before we look at what's new in these things called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, I think it's worth considering exactly what we mean by the term accessibility. There are many important terms and concepts that we're all expected to know about as UX professionals, and happily, many of them have at least one authoritative definition. And that's really important because we need to be confident that we're in general agreement with each other about what things mean, so that when you're talking to colleagues or partners or clients, there's no misunderstanding about what you're working towards. And many of the important terms we use are defined in ISO standards. So usability, user experience, accessibility, they're all defined in ISO 9241, which is an international standard for human-centered design. So let's have a look at those definitions. So starting with usability. Usability is defined as the extent to which a product can be used by specified users to achieve specific goals with effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction in a specified context of use. So what does that mean in plain language? Well, context of use is really the sort of the why, the how, the where, and by whom your products and services are used. And so usability is about whether users can carry out tasks with your products and services, how quickly and easily they can do that, and whether or not their needs and expectations are met while doing so. Let's look at the definition of accessibility. It's fairly similar. Accessibility is defined in ISO 9241 as the extent to which products, systems, services, environments, and facilities can be used by people from a population with the widest range of user needs, characteristics, and capabilities to achieve identified goals in identified contexts of use. So accessibility also covers the context of use, the why, the how, where, and by whom your products and services are used. But accessibility acknowledges that your users come from a population with diverse needs, characteristics, and capabilities. Now, because the focus on both of these definitions, usability and accessibility, is the context of use, we can't really have one without the other. If we want our users to be able to use our products and services and use them with ease whilst meeting their needs and expectations, we need to consider the access needs of that our users might have. And if we want to support users by designing for accessibility, we also need to consider whether users can work out how to complete tasks, how to do so quickly and easily, and whilst ensuring we meet their needs and expectations. So a usable website that is inaccessible is not really usable. And an accessible website that is unusable is not really accessible. A human-centered approach helps us consider both usability and accessibility because they are both human-centered qualities, and we can research and design for them. So if we care about human-centered design, we need to care about both accessibility and usability. Now, accessibility highlights the importance for us to consider users' needs, characteristics, and capabilities during the design process, and in doing so, accessibility supports people with disabilities. And disability also has its own definition, and it's one that's enshrined in UK law. Let's have a look at that definition.
Oops. We've got a bit of a situation like we did during COVID. I don't remember where I'm doing the slides, but John's doing the speaking. So apologies if we get the transitions wrong.
So the definition of disability from the Equality Act 2010 is that a person has a disability if they achieve a physical or mental impairment which has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on that person's ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. So by considering accessibility, we can ensure that we design and what we design and build is inclusive and that no one is left behind, especially people who have the protected characteristic of being disabled. Disabled people are vulnerable to exclusion if we do not take the effort to design in ways that enable them to participate. So how can we start thinking about designing for accessibility? Well, first of all, we need to go back in time. So at the dawn of the internet, life was pretty simple. On the screen, there is the first ever homepage that appeared on the World Wide Web. It was written by Tim Berners-Lee in 1990. That's when he invented this thing called HTML. And HTML was a means of presenting and navigating between electronic documents. And even before the first public release, this thing called HTML featured specific bits of code, which we refer to as semantic markup, but which are a way of describing different types of content that sit within that code. There are specific elements in HTML code for things like images, paragraphs of text, form input fields, buttons, headings. Pretty much any component or element of a page's structure has its own HTML code or semantic markup. And this is important because browsers and assistive technology are able to understand semantic markup and communicate the purpose of it, the purpose of those specific elements to users. For example, they can communicate to a user that what they are reading is a heading or a label of a checkbox. And many of the bits of semantic markup that Tim Berners-Lee invented all the way back in 1990 are still in use today. So things like the title element, anchor elements for linking off to other places, paragraphs, headings, heading structures, and those elements, lists, they were all introduced way before the first public release of HTML. So they're kind of like the foundation of HTML. It was always intended to be bits of code that make sense to computers so they can convey that information to users. Alt text was also introduced fairly early on, about 1993 that came in. And in the early days, the style and the presentation of websites, as you can see from this home page, which was pretty basic. The style and the presentation of websites was handled by the browser itself. So different browsers got to dictate how web pages and their various components should look. It wasn't up to the people writing the websites, it was the browsers that did that. And as more and more websites popped up, and print and graphic designers started to focus their attention on web pages, they quickly became frustrated with the lack of customization and design options available to them. Slowly, HTML started to introduce ways of being able to change how elements looked, such as the color and size of text. And in 1994, a means of completely separating content from presentation became available. So all of the content, the words, the images, the interactive things like the form elements, they all stayed in the HTML, and separate style sheets, known as CSS, you might have heard of CSS, cascading style sheets, they controlled how that content looked. So the colors, the font styles, the background colors, the borders around things, the position of the content. So if we fast forward a few years, people are merrily creating web pages with exciting visual treatments. And one of the delights for web designers back in the olden days was checking out the latest designs on this website called CSS Zen Garden. You can see on the screen, in the top left-hand corner, we've got just the HTML with no presentation at all. And the idea was that people could submit their own style sheets, their own ways and means of presenting the content, colors, positions, size of text and everything. And you could see this exact same content displayed in very different ways. So this site was perfect, a perfect showcase for what CSS could do, and great for designers to waste several hours on. Now, because many designers had come over from the world of print, to help them create pages without having to understand HTML, various organizations started to produce what we call WYSIWYG editors. WYSIWYG stands for what you see is what you get. And a WYSIWYG editor allowed designers to create websites just by dragging things around onto the page. So they didn't have to learn a single line of HTML code. And the majority of us use things like these nowadays. So WordPress, most content management systems they're all what you see is what you get editors. The good news is that they allow anybody to create web content. So you don't have to know any code at all. The bad news, because designers didn't need to go anywhere near the HTML, many people started creating websites with very little semantic markup. So although looking at the page, you could tell what was going on, the browsers didn't know what kind of content they were rendering. They didn't know if something was a heading or an input field, so they couldn't tell users. And all of a sudden, users had to rely on the visual appearance of elements. So they would only know that something was a heading based on what it looked like, or the size of the text in relation to the rest of the copy. Now, that is hugely problematic if you cannot see and you rely on your browser and assistive technology to read, interact with, and navigate web pages. So this became a big problem. So in May 1999, to address this growing problem, the Web Accessibility Initiative at the W3C introduced a new set of guidelines aimed at helping people create accessible web pages. And it looked a little bit like this. So the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines were born, and over time they become more commonly known as WCAG, which stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. In the introduction to the document, users were invited to understand a world beyond their own experiences by stating, for those familiar with accessibility issues pertaining to web page design, consider that many users may be operating in contexts very different from your own. And then it goes on to explain that some of your users may not be able to see, hear, or move, or process some types of information, or have difficulty reading or comprehending text. They might not be able to use a mouse or a keyboard. They might not speak or understand fluently the language in which the document is written. So it was inviting users of the guidelines to think more about their users and the fact that they may have very different experiences to the people creating the web pages. So this first version of WCAG was organized around 14 guidelines that had 65 checkpoints between them at priority 1, 2, or 3. And if we move on, we should be able to see an example of the first of those there. So the basis for determining, thank you, Louise, the basis for determining conformance to WCAG was the checkpoints themselves. And those original web content accessibility guidelines remained pretty stable until December 2008, so nearly 10 years later, which was when the next version was launched, version 2. For version 2, the web content accessibility guidelines were redeveloped into a set of guidelines that applied more broadly to different types of current and future web technologies than version 1 did, that were more easily testable using automated and manual testing, and they were developed with a view to the guidelines being adopted as an international standard. Now, WCAG is a technical document, and like many technical documents, some criticisms have been leveled at it. That one, it uses very technical language, and two, it's fairly dry and not very engaging. So all in all, it can have quite a high barrier to entry, and it does take a lot of time to get to grips with what is in the guidelines. But whenever we're talking about WCAG, what we try and do is break things down for anybody who's not overly familiar with it, and we try to bring it to life with examples and illustrations, and as Louise will explain later, cats. So where WCAG version 1 was organised around guidelines with priority checkpoints, WCAG 2 was organised around 4 design principles of web accessibility. Each principle had a number of guidelines, and each guideline has testable success criteria at 3 different levels: level A, AA, or AAA. The most easy to conform to would be level A. The most difficult or stringent success criteria are level AAA. Most people tend to aim for level AA for a number of different reasons, not least of all because there are public sector requirements in place now to meet AA standards. And the success criteria are the basis for determining conformance to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version 2. So version 2 was released with 12 guidelines and 61 success criteria. It was given a 13th guideline and 17 new success criteria 10 years later in version 2.1. That happened in 2018. And then 5 years after that, last October, we got version 2.2, which was released with 9 new success criteria, and one of them was removed, but more on those later. Before we move to version 2.2, let's have a look at what those principles, guidelines, and success criteria look like and how they work together in a bit more detail. So the 4 key principles that the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are based around are perceivable. Number 1 is perceivable. Are users aware of all the content and all of the components of the user interface? Are they able to detect them? Number 2 is operable. Are users able to access all content and UI components without barriers and regardless of input methods? So whether they're using keyboard, mouse, voice recognition, whatever they're using to access and navigate that information, can they access it? Number 3, understandable. Does information make sense to users? So can users predict what will happen when they start interacting with it? Does error messaging and error handling help users recover from errors and prevent errors in the first place? And the 4th principle is robust. So is everything coded to standards to ensure compatibility with and reliable interpretation by a range of browsers and assistive technology? Importantly, these are guiding principles like do no harm or seize the day. They're not specific rules, and as such they're not easy to design for, but it does really help to keep them in mind, as we can use them at any point to quickly validate what we're designing. So moving on, each principle contains a number of slightly more specific guidelines. Under perceivable, we've got text alternatives, time-based media, adaptable, and distinguishable. Operable has a number of guidelines, as does understandable and robust. I won't read all of them out now, Again, these are fairly broad top-level rules of thumb. So the first one is 1.1, text alternatives. And that is explained as provide text alternatives for any non-text content so that it can be changed into other forms people need, such as large print, braille, speech, symbols, or simpler language. Now, text alternatives 1.1 has just one success criterion, and that is non-text content. All non-text content that's presented to the user has a text alternative that serves the equivalent purpose, and then there are a few exceptions below there. Other guidelines have several success criteria. So 1.4, distinguishable, has 13 success criteria. Maybe we can see those on the screen now. There they go. So 1.4, distinguishable, is the guideline. There are 13 individual success criteria in there. So those success criteria are more specific measures or benchmarks. They're things we can actually design for. Just to make things really interesting, these also are not rules for implementation. There are a number of ways, technically, structurally, perceptibly, that you could meet any of these success criteria. So again, it's not a checklist, and that's a really important thing to remember. WCAG is guidance. I mean, it says so in the title, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. It is guidance, it's not a checklist. So you still need to research the context of use of your users and evaluate your designs with them. So let's have a look at what's new in 2.2. Like I said, WCAG version 2 was released in 2008, 2.1 came along in 2018, 2.2 arrived in October last year. And it does take the working group a long time to update these guidelines for several very good reasons. A, they are a voluntary organisation. B, it's really complex and technical. C, really importantly, a lot of us rely on the guidelines as they are. And they are enshrined in law, as we can see. They are referenced, if not explicitly, then implicitly in a lot of the laws and regulations across the world. So they have to be really careful when they get updated. So when we do get an update, it is significant, and it's important to see what it covers. So Louise, I think, is going to now give us an overview of what is new in 2.2.
Thank you for that. So joyously, yes, we're not going to go through all of the individual guidelines or success criteria involved in WCAG. That would take much longer than we have at this lunchtime. We're just going to pull out for you the new things. So if you're already familiar with WCAG, this is the stuff you might want to come and have a look at. And if you're not familiar with WCAG, if this is your first toe dip, you can make yourself sound really fancy by being like, oh yes, but I think there's a new guideline for that when talking to colleagues. So what has changed? We've got 9 additional success criteria. And essentially that's fundamentally it. And I have to say that was a great relief to me when I was waiting for this criteria. We still have the same principles, we still have the same guidelines, but within those we've got some additional success criteria to just update the way, in reflection to the way people use the internet and the types of digital content that we have. One of the criteria has been removed, parsing. We won't go into that today. It's now obsolete. So if you were using parsing, don't worry about it. It's gone. If you weren't, you don't need to learn. There are some additional notes in there. That's quite another interesting bit. The WCAG W3C have included some information about use of different languages and how to use language. Again, we haven't got time to cover all of that in this session, but it's something of note. And then we've also got something which I welcome. So I do know the technical side, but I'm more of a user experience practitioner than I am a developer. And for me, the introduction of individual user statements, and we will introduce some of those to you as we go through the session, and the definition of some of the people that we're talking about when we're talking about those people with access needs is a real welcome introduction. And I think it helps us to overcome some of those barriers to access that John was talking about earlier with the technical documentation, but we'll show you those as we go through. So as I said, we've still got 4 principles. We've still got 13 guidelines, and they're all still called the same thing. but we now have 86 different success criteria representing level A, AA, or AAA conformance. So you don't need to throw the whole thing away. The principles still look like this. So we haven't got to update too much. It's just a case of within some of those principles, and specifically within operable and understandable, we've got additional guidelines. We have additional success criteria under two of the guidelines in operable. So navigable and input modalities, and predictable and input assistance within the understandable category. So if you don't understand what any of those terms mean, don't worry, we'll describe them as we go through. But the key piece of information is that everything else is really quite stable, as John said, and we've just got some additional things for you to consider and look at when developing digital interfaces. So I'll hand back to John, who's going to take us through the first change to the guideline of navigable.
Thanks, Louise. So yeah, navigable. So website navigation has got two main functions, really. One, to tell users where they are at any point, and two, to help them get to somewhere else. And there are three new success criteria that fall into that first category, telling users where they are. The first two are 2.4.11, focus not obscured, brackets minimum, that's at level AA, and 2.4.12, focus not obscured, brackets enhanced, at level AAA. So the purpose of these two success criteria is to make sure that the thing that's receiving keyboard focus, the thing that you are tabbing to, is always at least partially visible on the user's screen. For sighted people who do not use a mouse or a pointing device, knowing where you are on a page is absolutely crucial. The focus indicator indicates the thing on the page that has focus, the thing that you're currently on, that you can interact with. And by default, browsers have their own focus indicator. So on Google Chrome, it's a blue ring that appears around an element when it's in focus, for example, when you tab to it. And you can easily check if a website has a focus indicator by repeatedly pressing the tab key on your keyboard. And as you press the tab key, your focus should jump to the next focusable element, be that a link or a button or a form field, whatever. And the element that has focus should have some kind of indicator that shows you where you are on the page. If you can't see where you are, which element has got focus, you might not know how to proceed. You might even think that the browser has crashed. And to give you a visual representation of what focus not obscuring means, we've got a cat hidden by a shower curtain. The quote that is on the page here, which says, "This page has a big banner that's always across the bottom, a sticky footer. When I move focus to items, some are hidden behind the banner and I can't see them." These are statements which are in the new 2.2 guidelines, which accompany each of the new success criteria to give you an idea of the problem. So they're little problem statements. So it's important to consider focus, because people who can't use a mouse need to see what has keyboard focus. And this includes keyboard-only users, switch users, and especially people who rely on voice recognition software who are able to navigate in a non-linear manner. So there are two success criteria. At level AA, a focused element must be partially visible, so you must be able to see some of it. At level AAA, the enhanced success criterion, a focused element must be totally visible, so no part of it must be hidden. So it looks like at level AA, there's a bit of room to maneuver. But what exactly does it mean by partially visible? Well, this is a bit of a problem. Visible is not clearly defined. On the next screen, there is a component on here that has focus, and it could be considered to be visible because we can see about a pixel of it. The eagle-eyed among you might have spotted the element that has focus, and we can see it if we scroll back up the page now.
Okay.
There we go. There we go. So it's the example button. You can see the focus around it. That was just visible below that sticky header. And it's not until we get to level AAA when no part of the component is hidden becomes the measure of success. But given that level AA is generally what most organizations are working towards, no part of the component is hidden is something that many people might not be considering because it's level AAA. So if you are just looking at level AA, please do take a look into the level AAA success criteria, because you will find some of them helpful. There is some helpful stuff in there that you could also adopt. Okay, the next success criterion is 2.4.13, focus appearance. Again, this is a AAA level success criterion. Focus indicators should meet specific criteria to be considered of sufficient size and contrast. And we can see a cat there transfixed by a laser dot. That's where its focus is. The quote, the user statement from the guidelines is, "I can see where the keyboard focuses as I move around a web page or app." So because we're at level AAA again, this is possibly something many people might not initially consider, but there's some really good guidance on the appearance of focus indicators here, which we don't get anywhere else in the guidelines. And accommodating focus appearance is ridiculously easy to do on your website. So I really would encourage you to adopt this particular success criterion anyway, even though it's level AAA. So the goal is to make it much easier for people to spot the keyboard focus, because many people can't see small changes in visual appearance. And how do we do that? Well, there are size and contrast requirements for focus appearance. Let's have a look at those. So the focus indicator needs to be at least as large as the area of a 2 CSS pixels, so 2 pixel thick perimeter of the unfocused component or the subcomponent. And it has to have a contrast ratio of at least 3:1 between the same pixels that it covers when it's focused in the focused and unfocused states. There are exceptions for browser settings. So if the focus indicator is determined by the browser and it can't be adjusted by the person creating the web page, for example, the options in a select drop down, then you don't have to adhere to this. It's already assumed that you'll conform. And if the focus indicator and the indicator's background color have not been modified. So in those examples of the very early web pages by Tim Berners-Lee, where he had applied no styling at all, hadn't modified the background color, hadn't modified the focus indicator, so therefore it's assumed to be okay. You do need to double check this if you're not actively changing the focus indicator, because some browser focus indicators are better than others. So even though you might strictly be complying, depending on the browser, that focus indicator could look quite weak. On the next screen, there's a little bit more information. So by stating that the size of the focus indicator has to be the size of a 2 pixel perimeter, the guidelines are considering the fact that your focused element might not be a rectangle. And you might also choose to have an indicator only on one side of the element, for example, across the bottom. Or you might prefer to have a dashed line rather than a solid line. And in those cases, you'd need to increase the thickness of the focus indicator so that it's equivalent in size to a 2 pixel perimeter. But as with many of the guidelines, conformance isn't always enough, and you do have to apply some common sense too. Next slide, please. So if the success criteria applies the pixels around the focus element, what happens if the focus indicator is a similar color to the element? Let's see. So this is a great demonstration of how following the letter of the guidelines might not result in you producing a totally accessible or usable website. If you can't see where it went to, the focus indicator went to the show live trains button. So in this example, the focus indicator has moved, the focus has moved to the show live trains button. It's equivalent in size to a 2 pixel perimeter around the button, and it has a contrast ratio twice that of the same pixels in the unfocused state. But the focus indicator is the same color as the button. If you were to tab between the input field and the button, you might notice the button looking bigger when it receives focus, and that's why it's considered acceptable within the guidelines. But you need to remember that the next element that receives focus might not always be in view before you tab to it. Some things to watch out for on the next screen. So missing focus indicators, indistinct focus indicators. Like I said, you don't have to specify a focus indicator if you haven't changed the background color. But if you're not specifying a focus indicator, make sure that it looks okay across the whole of your page. Make sure it is nice and distinct. Some things, other things to watch out for, things like persistent elements, so like sticky headers, footers, cookie notifications, things where the focus can get obscured, and what we call modal windows or pop-ups can be problematic as well if they're not coded properly. So a properly constructed modal dialog will always pass the success criteria. Even if it appears directly on top of an item with focus, the dialog box should take that focus when it appears. So if it's coded correctly, it will pass, but often they're not. The BBC do a really good job, provide a great example of what you can do. So they provided a double border as their focus indicator. So a light and a dark border nested within each other, both of them at 2 pixels. So at least one of these borders should provide a good contrast ratio between any adjacent color, as well as the color of any focusable elements. If you feel like finding out a bit more about focus, we've written about these new success criteria in a bit more detail on our blog. This is a bit of a bugbear of mine because I personally think keyboard accessibility is probably the most important aspect of web accessibility in terms of navigation and interaction for non-mouse users, to even being able to tell that content or functionality exists for blind users. If you can't access it with the keyboard, how can you tell whether it's there or not if you can't see? There are so many sites out there that hide the focus indicator simply because it doesn't look very nice or because it clashes with their color scheme. And whilst the guidelines could do a little more to ensure the guidance is watertight and applies at lower levels, because the really important ones are at level AAA, adhering to these success criteria will bring significant improvements. Again, just because they're level AAA, don't ignore them. They're really easy to conform to, and they can make a massive difference. Louise, tell us what's new in input modalities.
I love the term input modalities. I will confess, now that I'm, reputed to be good at this stuff, that it took me a very long time to work out what input modalities referred to. Basically, anything that you use to input to any kind of digital interface might be an input modality. So most of us will use a mouse or a trackpad. You might use your finger. That's an input modality. And for users of assistive devices, there's all sorts of technology, from eye tracking devices to literally sticks you put on your head, that people might be using to try and input or interact with digital environments. So what's changed? Are we loving the cat analogies? Because we're really going to start stretching these cat versions of the success criteria. So if you're trying to drag and drop something with a mouse interaction, so we have a cat dragging a little kitten, which is just too adorable. You need to make sure that that is an alternative is provided, and it uses the reference of a single pointer. So if you think about it, for some people, it's really quite difficult. You've seen me keep accidentally skipping through the slides today with my mouse. Being able to accurately press a mouse button, drag it along a trajectory, and then release a mouse button, as an example, or a touchscreen interface is really quite challenging for a lot of people. So to be able to click in one place and then move and then click in the end point, or to have an alternative mechanism to to interact in that way is really important. So it's been recognised within the guidelines with the success criteria, and it's AA. So it's something, most people are going to try and get to. Let's have a look at some examples. Oh yes, we've got a lovely user statement. I cannot hold the mouse down and drag it accurately enough to move the items in this list. And I think that really illustrates how powerful these statements are, because they've come from WCAG. So if you are having conversations, maybe trying to persuade people, just grab one of these statements. They're really, really helpful to visualize what happens when this can't be done. Some examples then of dragging movements you might want to check in with. Things like map views. Pinch to zoom is a classic one. Any kind of scale or slider. Sortable lists. We all have a Kanban board, a Trello-based interaction, to name but a few. Task boards. Radial controls. So quite often you'll see things like color pickers, where you're sort of moving something within a specified zone. Classic drag and drop, typically used to move files or items from one area to another. And of course the sliders. So John started by explaining how the origins of the internet were really quite simple in terms of, the semantic. It was quite easy to create those semantic structures. It was mostly just text and the occasional image with some hyperlinks. But now we really are accustomed to seeing, browser-based interactions and other interactions that are, much more complicated than that. And this is an example of Canva, something lots and lots of people use. And just to highlight one of the many sort of mouse-based or drag and drop type of interactions on this page, there's a slider here at the bottom. And interacting with this slider will zoom the view of the core, so it says business project. So whatever your piece of work is will increase or decrease the view, the size of that view. Canva have actually gone to some lengths to make sure that this is keyboard accessible. So if you can navigate to this element with a keyboard quite easily, and once you're there, you can use the up-down arrows to increase or decrease the numeric value and therefore the zoom. The little indicator, slider indicator, will move with you. The number will increase or decrease. And what I particularly like is that the view of the content will automatically resize. You don't have to wait and perform a submit, which could lead to lots of backwards and forwards trying to get the size right. So it's definitely possible. And this is a really nice example of an alternative to a drag and drop. Are we breaking you yet? So the smallest cat we could find for the smallest target size that is acceptable under the new WCAG guidelines. The user story here is the buttons are so close. I hit cancel when I'm going for submit. And key to this, imagine being in this situation, then I have to go back and start all over again. So just this week, I was talking to some participants in some testing that we did who had pain-related fatigue. And they will just have to end a process if they are, they will become exhausted and not be able to complete processes anyway, let alone if something like this happens and they have to lose everything they've started and go back. So these kind of things are really significant for individuals. The current guidelines say that all interaction target zones, so whether you're designing for a mouse or for a touch, will need to occupy an exclusion area of 24 pixels. So that must mean they must have a 24 pixel space in which you're not going to hit any other interactive element. Please feel free to debate that size in the chat. I personally feel, having come up through the iOS user interface guidelines for touchscreen interfaces, that 24 pixels is actually pretty small. So you will conform to AA if you hit a 24 pixel minimum. I would suggest if you want to deliver accessible interfaces, you could aim a lot higher than that, and you still might be creating challenges for a lot of users. WCAG have included some visual guidance on how to implement this and what will pass and what will fail. So you can see there in the top line that the interactive element itself is 24 pixels wide. So stack those up against each other, you have no problem and you'll pass. But what if your designers have given you an interactive element which is less than 24 pixels? Well, you can see in the second row there that as long as you provide a buffer of 4 pixels in this case, because the interactive element is 20 pixels wide, you will still create that exclusion zone and have a 24 pixel radius. No, hang on, is it radius? No, diameter. It's my GCSE maths coming through. Area in which people can touch without hitting anything else. But the example at the bottom where somebody has used a 20 pixel without a buffer means that those areas, those zones of interaction will overlap and they won't conform to the guideline. It also applies if you're using text, so just be mindful. For example, if you're using navigation, text as navigation, that if you don't provide spacing between the lines of text, the size of the font will potentially put you into an overlap situation. So you've got an example of a 16 pixel high font there without a buffer, and that would fail. There are exceptions. Obviously, we are skimming over the surface of all of these guidelines today. There are exceptions within the success criteria. This doesn't apply if it's inline text. So if you're linking text within a paragraph, it doesn't need to apply. Okay, so that was all the ones that related to the operable. I'm going to hand back to John, and we're going to look into predictable as the criteria within understandable as well. I am keeping an eye on all your questions. I know that we're running up to time, so I'll answer as many of those as I can within the chat.
Thanks, Louise. Yeah, and if there are any questions that we don't get around to answering and we do run out of time, then we'll respond to them personally, and if we can, we'll try and make the responses public somehow. I'm not entirely sure how. There's a challenge. Okay, so understandable 3.2 predictable. So 3.2 predictable is all about helping users with disabilities by presenting content in a predictable order from page to page, and by making the behavior of functional and interactive components predictable. It can be difficult for some users to form an overview of a page or understand spatial relationships between content or controls. And so being able to predict what's going to happen as you move through a web page is really important. People who use screen magnifiers might see, for example, only part of the screen at any one time. Users with cognitive limitations might become confused if components appear in different places on different pages. Blind screen reader users might know, for example, that if the account button might be in the top right-hand corner of a mobile app, and so we'll tap that directly rather than having to swipe through everything else in the header to get to it. So having things in a predictable, consistent place makes it a lot easier for users to navigate. So let's look at the new success criteria for predictable. The first one is 3.2.6, consistent help. This is a level A success criterion, so a nice basic one to do. The user statement is, whenever I use the online app to schedule my medical appointments, I can't remember what to do at each step. I've seen a chat option in some places, but can't find it now. And we're looking at a picture of somebody using their laptop, and the cat is consistently providing help in the way that only a cat can. So when help for online activities is available, it needs to be placed consistently within the content order and display so it can be easily found by all users. People who need help can find it more easily if it's in the same place. So if a web page contains human contact details, a mechanism for contacting a human, a self-help option, or a fully automated contact mechanism, and those mechanisms are repeated on multiple web pages within a set of within a website, they should occur in the same order relative to other page content that also exists on every other page. And by the same order, we mean the same serialized order, so the same tab order, not necessarily the same visual order. So if you turned all of the styling off, they would be in the same order as you tab through the page. Now, ideally, the serialized order, the tab order, and the visual order would be the same. And there are other success criteria that deal with that. However, that is not required for conformance here. Serialized order does not have to match visual order to conform to this specific success criteria. Because this is quite a tricky one to ascertain, it does require manual testing. So you'll have to inspect those things manually rather than just rely on automated testing. The next one is under the guideline 3.3, input assistance. So we all make mistakes when we're filling in forms, and we often find them laborious. People with some disabilities may have more difficulty filling in forms. They might also find it harder to recognise that a form has an error in it, maybe because the form relies on the user's field of view, their perception of colour, or their memory. So 3.3 input assistance is all about reducing the number of errors that are made, increasing the likelihood that any errors will be noticed by users, and helping users understand what they need to do to fix or recover from an error. So let's look at the new success criteria for 3.3 input assistance.
This is my favourite cat, by the way.
This is not your favorite. This is not your favorite photo. This is your second favorite photo. This is my favorite one. We're coming to the end, so we have the best photos till last. So for this success criterion, which is 3.3.7 redundant entry, there is a photo of a cat going through a cat flap when the door is already open. Brilliant. Only a cat, right? The user statement is, whenever I use the online app to schedule my medical appointments, I have to retype some information that I entered in the previous step. So users should not be asked to enter the same information twice in the same session. So what we need to do is make it easier for users to complete multi-step processes. Multi-step processes can be mentally and physically tiring, and this is exacerbated when users are forced to remember or to re-enter information. Users with learning or cognitive disabilities are particularly susceptible to mental fatigue, since they generally have reduced working memory or increased cognitive load to begin with. Users with fibromyalgia or ME are susceptible to physical fatigue. For users with mobility impairments who rely on voice recognition or switch controls, data entry can be extremely laborious. So don't ask for the same information more than once in the same session. Let's look at how we can meet the redundant entry success criteria. So repeated information should either be auto-populated or available to select. So by auto-populated, that means from, for example, a password manager. The browser's built-in autocomplete is not enough to satisfy this success criterion, because users still have to go through each line. And they might not use autocomplete anyway, or they might be using their friend's device, or they might be in an internet cafe or whatever. So browser autocomplete is not enough to be able to satisfy this one. And by available to select, that means, well, that could mean, for example, use my shipping address as my billing address from the previous step, or be able to select it from a list. When I changed energy provider last time, I had to input my address 3 times on 3 different pages. They could easily have taken that data from the first time I entered it and offered that as an option for the second and third time. There are some exceptions to this one. You don't have to meet it where re-entry is essential. So that's for things like memory games, where obviously the whole point of the game is to remember something and type it in again. Where the information is required to ensure the security of the content or of other data. So, for example, typing in your password and then confirming your password. So you need to type that in for reasons of security. And where information that was previously entered is no longer valid, for example, a one-time passcode, which would expire because it's only once only that you'd use it. Again, this is a success criterion that requires manual testing. So you have to do that manually, inspect that manually. Louise, very quickly, why don't you tell us about accessible authentication?
I'm just going to apologise for my keyboard. I switched to the quieter keyboard and apparently it was still very loud. Sorry, I've been trying to keep up with some of the questions. We will look at authentication, and John is right. This is my favourite cats. So I've asked to present this one because I'm so excited about this, because this update is subtitled "Death to Captures" or Catchers, and here are the user stories. So I can never remember my password. It's really hard for me to get into this app. And as someone who works with people with cognitive impairments, this is the end game for a lot of people. So putting things like this into your designs can actually just create obstacles that can't be overcome for certain users. And then WCAG have put this into their guidelines. To get into this app, it's asking me to click on pictures of cats, but I can't tell which are cats and which are bred. So these are framed and termed, the term for these type of tests is cognitive function tests. And it's anything where users are asked to solve, a riddle or a puzzle, or those kind of typical things where you have to prove that you're human. If you need to transcribe something from somewhere else, so another app or another interface or another screen, into the interface that you're using, so two-factor authentication will often cause these kind of problems for people. And it's not, so the whole principle around accessibility is that we should provide an equivalent level of service regardless of somebody's needs or abilities. And this is one clear example where the level of service isn't equivalent. If you're not capable of doing these things, you won't get through the door. So death to catchers. The guidelines do include some alternatives, so they don't just leave you hanging. And again, if this is an area of interest to you or relevance to you, please do go into the full guidance and explore it there. Hopefully we've given you sort of a framework for that. So you can use password managers, make sure people can cut and paste things. There are a couple of core protocols which you can look into. And again, they list some alternatives like USB sticks and device authentication. And one of my favorites is shown here. So instead of using login with a password, you can have a link sent to your already pre-registered email address, and it will identify you as you. But I'm going to whiz through all that because we're at time, I believe, or very near to it. So hopefully that has given you sort of a quick oversight of not just what WCAG is, but what's changed. And as we said, there's not really that much that's changed. What has been introduced is the more human element to WCAG. And I just want to, before we go, mention the user stories. So the official 2.2 release includes a number of what they call user stories, which are more closely aligned for most of us as personas or archetypes. And they are intended to represent different types of impairments that people might have and the lived experience of those people. And it can be great. It's really good for us to broaden our understanding. Like I say, I'm privileged to be a clinical physiotherapist, but it gives me a little bit more access to that kind of information. So there's lots of positives around this kind of content. I encourage you to read them, and it helps to develop empathy, of course. But also I would just like to put in a cautionary note. So obviously everybody's individual experience is highly different. And even if you have a similar condition to someone else, there are so many diverse factors about you as a whole person, which might change the choices you make, the skills you have, the needs you have, or the technology you use. So just a word to guard against creating stereotypes off the back of these. We always would like to ask our users. That's all from me. John has a little bit of blurb to give you about the training courses that we offer. And I will continue to type noisily into the chat while he does that. I'll put myself on.
Thanks, Louise. Yeah, so just a quick note that if you're interested in finding out more about accessibility, particularly at a practical level, practical things that you can take away and actually, changes you can start making, we do have a training course all about that. And it's part of our suite of training courses that we offer. There should be an offer coming up on your screen as well for £50 off any training course. Lots of training courses there that cover the whole gamut of whole range of human-centered design techniques and methodologies and strategies and things like that. We're also a recognised training provider for the UXQB, so for the Certified Professional User Experience courses. We run the Foundation in Human-Centered Design, which is a 3-day course with certification. There's essentials in UX and HCD management if you're looking after a team of UXers, and advanced level usability testing and evaluation course as well, which is taught over 3 days. If you're interested in any of those, go to the website or speak to Joe at bunnyfoot.com. If you've got anything else you want to speak to about us, then please get in touch with Joe. I think what we're going to do with the questions, because we're woefully over time, is we've got your contact details, so we'll find a way of getting some answers to you for those questions. Yeah, and I just want to thank you all for taking up an hour and a bit of your time today. Thanks ever so much indeed. I hope you found it useful. Let us know if there's anything else you want to find out about, or if you've got any other ideas for things you'd like to hear about in webinars, whether that's to do with accessibility or any other aspect of human-centered design. That's everything from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. It was a lovely session. Like I say, we'll try and get to your questions when we can.